I live on a farm and we pasture graze beef, and these cattle became a big part of my story. And I've lived on a farm all my life. And so I've been accustomed with working with animals, livestock in particular. Uh, every morning, every morning, I would typically go out to the pasture to just check on them, to visually inspect. And because I had been close enough with those animals over a long period of time, I could get amongst them just, as they're grazing, and they wouldn't even bother to look at me. I mean, it was just a comfortable symbiotic relationship with the animals. That morning, and this was in an early October morning, um, I walked out there to the pasture just to inspect them, and they were all lying down in the grass. And I didn't get 300 feet to them, and one of them jumped up and looked at me and perked her ears like cattle will do when they see something they're not sure of, and took off running at a fast pace about 600 feet away, and stopped and turned around and looked at me. And I thought, well, this is really unusual because it's never happened before quite like that. Well, all of her commotion caused the others to pay attention, and they got up very quickly, looked at me to see what it was, and they took off to join the other one that had first run. I thought, this has never happened. What's going on? But I kind of shrugged my shoulders and thought, well, it's kind of an unusual morning. Uh, and I saw what I had to see, so I left. I turned around and I walked back towards, across the pasture towards our house. That morning, I was scheduled to have the tires on our car replaced. So I got changed and I went into our local village, which was 12 miles away. I realized I was very early and I had time to go to an exercise session. I had been going for the previous 6 months, 8 months, to our local hospital's fitness center as a trying to get to a point where I could lower my blood pressure. Now, historically, I'd never had high blood pressure, but in the previous 8 to 10 months, it had steadily increased. So they put me on an exercise program and a diet, and I was going there 3 times a week. Well, instead of turning right to go to get the car tires changed because I had extra time, I turned left and I went to our local fitness center, and which is run by our local hospital. I went downstairs, changed, came back up, said hello to the 5 staff people that were in the room, as I usually did when I was there. And I did my stretches and went and did 20 arm curls. I got up from that arm curl machine, and the strangest thing happened. Both of my forearms started to tingle, like when you lie on them and they go to sleep on you, and then you get up and they all tingle. Well, both of them were like that. And I thought, this is really unusual. And that happened to be the last thing I remember for at least the next 8 hours. I'll come back to it, but I did find out later all of the things that were going on in the room after my collapse. But in that moment, after I realized my arms were tingling, my next memory is of being in a different dimension. And I know that because I was sitting on, to use a human term for what I was on, would be like a raft, a small raft where I was floating. But I wasn't floating on water. I was floating on energetic waves that were coming towards me. And not only were they coming towards me, they were going through me. And I thought, well, this is really, really interesting, but I have no idea where I am. And as I sat there and just watched as these waves came in, I felt all this unconditional love. That's the best way I can express it. It was warmth. It was welcoming. It was uh, the greatest thing I could feel if I were physically present. It was just a very welcoming atmosphere. So I looked around to my sides, and there were others or other entities doing the same thing, floating on these waves of energy that were continually coming from in front of us as we understand direction, passing through and continuing on back. And I thought, well, I guess I'm not here by myself, but I don't know who all these other entities are. It was at that point I looked up to see what was in front of me. And as I looked up, I could look through my hands. What were, to my sense at that point, my energetic hands, because they were translucent, because the waves were passing through them as well. It would be like having a hologram of yourself and being able to see through it and still realize that you were yourself, but in a different form. Well, when I looked up, I did not see any clouds. I did not see any borders. I did not see any walls, no barriers. It was the biggest amphitheater I had ever witnessed or could witness. It was just immense, immense as in eternal. It went on in all directions. But yet, in the center of all this would be what I can best describe as a golden globe that was emanating all of this energy, that waves that I could see that were passing through and beyond. And looking at this pulsating golden globe of, I mean, if you put 10 million suns together, that doesn't even cover it. But it was such a warm, welcoming presence. I mean, I could actually, even though I thought I was a distance away from it, I could reach out and touch it as if I were one with it and not get burned up. So the other thing I saw besides these waves were little, what I would call little energetic sparkles or sparks coming out in all directions. I mean, they were flying all over. And I thought, well, this is some source, because everything is emanating from it. All this energy, all of these other entities are sitting here, almost, becoming part of it again. And there were others coming out of it, or maybe other things. I had no idea. And what I realized then was that this was a source of all creation. Something was creating it. It was, if you will, a God essence. And I use that term mainly because it's easier for an explanation of what I saw. A divine creator, whatever term you want to apply to something that is that immense, that welcoming, that flow of love, that knowledge. Because at the time I sat there, all of a sudden I realized, well, this is what it is. This is all knowledge in front of me. And when I saw these little sparks come out, I just kind of turned to see, and they were all going into the area, the dimension behind me, which is when I decided to turn around and take a look to see what was behind me, because it'd be like going on a trip and not taking a look at a side road. And so I turned around, and the best way I can describe it is to say I saw eternity. And by that I mean, it was like there was this emulsion of energy that as it flowed and formed and let energy through, it still created like a magnification of what I was looking at in the distance. And the ironic thing is, the farther I looked, the clearer it became, which in human terms is really not possible. But I realized at that point, I didn't know I was dead. I didn't know that my body was still back down at the fitness center. I was just here in this place that felt so comfortable, so welcoming, so loving, that, yeah, it was so great. And the other interesting thing I saw in this whole dimension, whether we call it up, down, sideways, north, south, front, back, take your pick. Those are human terms we use so we can have some sort of common agreement as direction. What I saw were universes beyond human comprehension, infinite. And the best way I can explain it is if you think about taking the universe that we are presently in here on this planet, and you compress everything, all the billions of light years across and everything, you compress that down to a single sheet of paper, and then you suspend it out here in this eternal dimension. And then you have another one right next to it, another one right next to that, another one right next to that, as you're going in one direction. And then you go in the other direction and you have all these other universes lined up. And then you have them, as we understand, up and down and sideways and lengthwise. Each one of these universes had a filament that were going back to this gigantic source, this God essence in front of me. So the energy that I was feeling was also being filtered and directed into all of these other universes. And it wasn't as if I had to acknowledge it, because I knew that this is how we were created, this is how we are sustained, and this is where I came from. Now, I can't prove that and quantify it, but it's what I experienced. And I'll come back to the rest of it, but I just want to go off on a little side thing here. I know it's true. I know my experience is true, because if you think about, everyone has dreams. And when you have a dream at night, sometimes in the morning you wake up and think, well, that was weird. Or you think that, I wish I could remember what it was about. Dreams have this unique thing about dissipating in front of us. They're like a fog that disperses. So a lot of dreams that I have now, I can't remember. However, I can remember exactly everything that I experienced in that dimension, and I brought it back with me. I don't know how, and I don't know if there's more to it than that, but that is why I can explain what I saw, because it is with me all the time. In fact, it's gotten to the point now, several years later, where I don't even have to close my eyes to think about it, because I can see it in the background of everything that I look at. I can see it in the background of you. I can see it in the background of the person or people that I talk with here. It's not something that is distressful. It's very comforting, because I know that I am just a moment away from experiencing that whole dimension again. Um, so at that point, uh, it came to where 8 hours later, I realized I was in a hospital. And that's when a lot of the confusion started, because I was in this wonderful experience, and now I'm in a hospital looking at the clock, and it says 8 o'clock on the wall. And I said, well, that can't be right. And that's the first thing I remember. Uh, and somebody said, why not? I said, well, it can't be 8 o'clock in the morning because time doesn't go backwards here. I was at the fitness center at what, 11, you know. And whoever it was, I assumed a doctor, said, well, it's 8 o'clock at night. And so I had this 8 hours, a little over 8 hours of time that I have absolutely no recall. And even now, a number of years later, I still don't. So in order to understand what happened during those 8 hours, I had to do some interviews. And after I was released from the hospital and went through several months of recovery, uh, then I started to wonder why, because things were slowly starting to come back to me. Not what happened here, but what happened in that dimension. And it was then that, you know, the real confusion started, because none of it made any sense. And I likened it to I was like 1 foot in this dimension, and then I was 1 foot in this dimension right here, trying to almost have an energetic tug of war as to where I wanted to be. It was a time where not only the confusion but the physical uh, exhaustion from what happened. Essentially, what happened was that I had my heart stopped, and it took them over 6 minutes to restart it after a couple of electric shocks and also a lot of CPR. So once I was able to realize something significant happened, I did get a hold of the 11 people on the EMT squad, the hospital staff, the 11 people that were involved with my recovery, and I was able to sit and interview them to find out what happened in those 8 hours. Now, they all said that after they got my heart started again, it was shortly after that I started talking, answering questions. Uh, they were trying to keep me awake, apparently. One said, because you can have another uh, relapse. And so they were very watchful of me. And understanding that I couldn't make sense of anything, they knew exactly what they did. They didn't know what the person next to them was doing, but they knew exactly what they did. And this was 7, 8 months later when I started talking with them. So it was something that helped me try to understand what happened while I was in the fitness center. Which has led me to understand one thing, is that we are more than the sum of our parts. Our bodies are more than the sum of our parts, because I had the same body parts while I was standing looking at my arms that were tingling as I did when I was flat out on the floor, not breathing, and my heart stopped. Except for one thing. That part of me, that inner essence, you can call it your soul, you can call it your whatever, uh, that had gone. And that's where I was up in this dimension. And that made sense to me, because once they got my heart started again, I had to come back. Or I had to not come back. Uh, Apparently, that was my choice. So the whole episode of what I experienced there has created a better understanding for me of what not only lies ahead for me, but it lies ahead for everyone else that I talk to, whether they want to believe it or not. Because the one thing I learned is that we will continue to go on regardless of what we think here. And whether or not we want it to, we will still go on because the innermost essence of us, the soul, if you will, is not destroyed. That continues. Now, we're going to slough off this body because this body is not made for long-term use. So I've used an analogy as I began to work through and understand these things. Okay, in 1951, for some reason that I'm not sure about yet, I decided to get off the energetic superhighway, drive down in the off-ramp, and came down into this lower level of energetic existence. I was born of my parents. I was raised by them, my family. I grew up with them. I'm now here 72 years, a little more, 73 coming up. But I won't be here forever. So when my body uses up its fuel and I depart for good, I'm going to get back on that on-ramp to the energetic superhighway, and I'm going to go on to my next experience because I will still exist, only in a different form than what we see visually here. Each one of us has that divine spark, that DNA of the source of all creation, the God essence, if you will. We are all part of that. And that is why I do believe we will never be destroyed. Now, yes, this body's going to give way, but we will continue to go on. That is the hope that I think I'm trying to express to everyone, is that this is not the end of it, regardless of what you think, how times may not be very well for you at this moment. I'm not saying you should leave, but what I'm saying is that you have a choice to use the time here to enjoy it, to make the best of it. You don't have to throw it away because this life is good. This life is worth living. But yet, if things go haywire, it's not the end of you. It's not the end of me. It's not the end of your family or your friends or even the people you don't even like, because they all have that same DNA, essence of God. And God will accept them just like they did me. Now, I'm not, it took a long time to understand why I came back. But that's the essence of my experience while I was in a different dimension. And coming to this dimension, I had to take the form of a physical body because even though it's a lower energetic level than where I was, because I couldn't experience the same things, the tactile things, the visual things, in the same way as if I came here as just a spark as a spirit. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. It's just that, well, our experience here is to touch things, feel things, whether it's emotion, whether it's tactile, whatever. That's why we're here. We're here to learn. We sure as heck didn't come here to be destroyed or punished. So that's the essence of what I guess my story is.
I love it, and it's such a beautiful story, Philip. It's so amazing, and what I'm always impressed by is, this fact that you just know that there's different dimensions. It seems like communication is just way easier and almost telepathic, like you have that information already. You don't wander and get an answer. You just know what things are.
Well, I think that's true. again, I can't quantify it, but I can give you an example. When I was during my recovery period, and it was more, well, it was physically challenging because I was exhausted from the collapse, and then they put me on blood pressure medication, which did not help, and that actually led to my second collapse 10 months later. Um, Understanding what happened was so primary as to why did this happen, when it happened, where it happened, with all that help available. Now, the doctor said, well, you got lucky, but I don't believe in coincidences anymore. I think there was some sort of a pathway, an energetic pathway laid out for me to make decisions one way or another. And one of them was to turn left instead of turning right. Had I gone to get my, you know, tires changed, I wouldn't have been where people could have helped me. Had I collapsed in our pasture just an hour earlier, nobody would have found me for 6 or 8 hours. So that wouldn't have been useful. So the question of why was a really driving force to understand the whole, how all these different parts fit into the whole. And it came to me apparently in the middle of a night. As I said, I was a bit sluggish because of all of because of the blood pressure medications they were giving me. It actually drove it down too low. And incidentally, I did not have any residual damage to my heart after all the electric shocks and the CPR they did. I had 2 blockages, which they put 2 stents in and opened them up, and after that, everything was fine. People didn't understand why I looked so good after what happened. So understanding why this happened where it did was really a big deal for me, and which is why I got my medical reports. I was trying to understand the timeline. I talked to the EMTs and the hospital staff, talked to anybody who had something to contribute to the story, especially my wife and our son and daughter, which is a whole different aspect of having a near-death experience, is how it affects them. The one morning I came downstairs for breakfast and plopped myself into the chair, and my wife Mary was sitting at the other end of the table, and she was looking at a notepad she had, and she said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, okay." She said, "Do you want to hear what you said last night?" I said, "Well, I didn't say anything. I was asleep, as far as I know." She said, No, you said something last night, and I wrote it down." Fortunately, she kept a notepad by her table next to the bed, and I said, "Okay, go ahead." And she said, "Well, you sat up in the middle of the night and you were just talking to yourself. I couldn't understand what you were saying, but you were just going on about something." And then after that stopped, she said, "You started shaking your head from one side to the other. It's saying, 'I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't believe it.'" And she said, "What don't you believe?" And she said, I told her, "I don't believe why I was sent back." And she said, "Well, why were you sent back?" And she said, I told her I was sent back to be a conduit of hope for those who don't have any or don't think there is any, because there is. And she paused, and I said, "Well, what else?" "Nothing. You laid back down and went to sleep." And that was the end of it. The interesting thing, in that moment, I knew exactly, I had my answer as to why I came back and I didn't stay. At some level, I had agreed to do this, and I'm not sure what the reason is yet, but it is part. I won't say I'm on a mission, but it is the thing that will take up the rest of the time I have here. Now, I still have 2 jobs I work at. The farm, I do a lot of writing, and I have a animal consultant business as well. So that's three. But anyway,
That's a lot of jobs.
well, I stay busy. And fortunately, there are people such as you, Sabrina, who are interested in hearing about this. So I have been doing a number of interviews. And before this even started, what I'm doing with the podcast, I did sit down. It was about 6 months after my collapse. I started making notes as I was thinking of things, and eventually that turned into memories of things I experienced and writing those out, but not only the memories, but trying to understand why. How did this fit in? All these different pieces. So it became a manuscript, which eventually became a book, which is now out. But the important thing is that getting to a point where I understood these things was really critical. And then once I understood them, I needed to know, is any of it true? Um, did I imagine it? Which is the question one of the hospital nurses asked me. This was about 4 months after my collapse. I was invited back to talk with some nurses about my experience. And one of them did ask, well, do you think you could have been imagining it? And I said, well, that's possible. But how could I possibly know those things and feel those things in another dimension and be able to bring them back here and still feel the same way? Because when I think about being there, every time I get this same welling up of warmth and love that I had felt there. So how does that transfer? And why would it be that way if it wasn't true? I have since come to understand that we have, call it spirit guides, if you will. Some people can call it angels. Whatever it would be, that is a other dimensional entity that I don't think they tell us what to do. I do believe they provide pathways of choice. And so if my pathway of choice was to uh, go in for an exercise session versus getting my tires changed, well, then that's the choice I made. Now, I can't tell you what would have happened had I made the other choice, but we live with the choices we make, and good, bad, or indifferent. And so part of trying to understand what a spirit guide was, I had attended a workshop. First of all, I did not know what an NDE was before mine happened. I did not read anybody else's account, especially while I was writing my own, because I specifically stayed away from it so I could keep my own experience to myself until I could get it worked out. Come to find there are a lot of similarities with other people who have had NDEs. Not the same, but there are similarities that I'm aware of. So I attended a workshop where the person handling it is a well-respected channel, and at one point, he has the group stand in line, and he comes and he mirrors us, and we can actually see ourselves on his face. I don't know how that works, but I can tell you it does. Anyway, he came to mine, and at this point, I got this strobe light flash from one of his eyes, and instantly I knew that was one of my spirit guides. And during the question and answer afterwards, I explained what happened, and I asked if what I experienced in that other dimension was true, because I needed to know that it was true. And the spirit guides said yes, it was true in that sense for you. And then I was really pleased, because I knew I was not imagining it. And that was important, because if I was going to write something about it or even talk to someone else, I didn't want to be deceived that I was, explaining something I had just imagined. I didn't want to deceive myself. And in turn, I did not want to deceive others with a false narrative. So once I understood that my experience was true and that's the way it was, then I was very pleased with owning it. Yeah. Which also got me to another analogy I've used is that if you, with all the information that I was exposed to in that other dimension, which is infinite, I mean, it has all the answers you could possibly ask for, and it has all the questions you could possibly ask. So when you have all knowledge available, it's quite a wondrous thing. But how do you bring that back here? Well, I don't think we do. I certainly know. Well, I don't think I did. And I'll say, okay, take for example, if each of us has a brain with 2 gigabytes of memory, and all of a sudden you're exposed to infinite knowledge, and you take 1,000 terabytes and try to cram it into this 8 gigabyte memory, what's going to happen? Well, you're probably going to crash it. So that would not be useful. A little bit would be useful, yes, but not the whole thing. And I think that getting to the point of knowing all knowledge is something that we can do once we are beyond how we limit our usage here. Okay, so that's why I think that I was only allowed a certain amount of information to come back with me that I could safely handle and understand. Since this episode happened, and it's now 8 years, it took me a year to physically get back in shape. It took me 3 years to write out my thoughts, and then it's not something that immediately you can come out and say. I mean, my wife even a year later still had not quite the comprehension of what I had experienced. Well, she couldn't, because it wasn't her experience. But because of that knowledge, I understand things better of what lies out there. And again, no one has to agree with me because this is my experience. I am just explaining what I saw and experienced. And if people want to consider that, I would appreciate it because it's something that I think would be useful for them. But, I'm not going to beat them over the head telling them that I'm the only right person to talk to because there are others. Go look at somebody else. So I'm one story of many, but I'm grateful for the experience I had. Now, I wouldn't suggest to everybody to go have a sudden cardiac death to have a near-death experience, but for me, I'm grateful, even though my family isn't, because it was somewhat of a traumatic time for them, not knowing, first of all, if I'd survived, what kind of mental shape I'd be in after I did progress in recovery. So, yeah, there's a whole after effects relating to the family or a spouse that we could get into, but we may be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because if something happens to you, it does not just affect you, it affects a whole family, it affects your wife, it affects your children, it affects your business and your jobs. So there's this whole domino of everything that's happening and that you need to consider, of course. But to the point where you said, you wouldn't recommend everybody have a near-death experience because usually it is tied to a health issue. But I do think, and what I hear very often is we don't need to be so close to death itself to become more spiritual, to become more in touch with our guides. We can always reach out and we can try to understand the beyond. And I think the audience that we have, especially from reading all their stories in the comments, I think they're usually people that are looking for answers, and they're not negative at all. They're just people that want to advance their own knowledge. And this is what they're looking for. They're looking for inspiration. They're looking for information. And I think that's a wonderful thing, because I think by sharing these NDEs and, for instance, what you've seen and what you've experienced and what others have seen and experienced, I think we create this collective pool of knowledge, if you will, and of inspiration that we can then all benefit from, even if we haven't had an NDE.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would suggest to anyone who's interested, look at as many stories as you can. See what you can take from it. Maybe you don't agree with it. You may want to ask why you don't agree with it, which will serve as an inward-looking aspect of it. And like I said, I'm just one story of many, and certainly I'm not a prophet. I'm just another human being who had an extraordinary experience, and I'm trying to explain it as best I can. But I encourage your viewers or anyone else to take a look at what's out there. Now, you may not agree with some of them or any of them, and that's your choice. And I don't see anything wrong with that. Personally, at the moment, I don't have time to start looking at other people's. And not that I don't find them interesting. It's just that, they have theirs, and that's their story. I have mine, and this is my story. And so it's not a competition, which I hope people will realize, that it's not one person trying to say, well, I had more near-death experiences than this other person. Well, that's not the point.
No,
to me,
exactly.
The point is, what can you get from it? I cannot do anything other than try to explain to people that there is hope, regardless of what you think, because it's there. And I may not be the most bubbly person in the world to come across, but the self-satisfaction of knowing what there is makes it easier for me to have discussions with people who maybe are skeptic, maybe they don't want to believe. But it does allow me a chance to say, okay, well, this is it. You don't have to believe it. You can examine it, which may help in some portion of your life. And that's good enough for me.
I absolutely love that so much of your message is about hope. And I think that's something that all of us need nowadays. But I also think that sometimes when we go through our own challenges, maybe because of disease, maybe because of grief, maybe because of depression, maybe because of other challenges we're going through, it's just really, really difficult, and it becomes very hard to find that hope.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What do you say to those people that just feel like they're scratching the bottom of the barrel and there's no hope to be found?
I would suggest them to reach out to others who are in a position to help, whether it's physically, health concerns, whether it's emotional needs, whether it's family members. Sometimes we have to swallow our pride. In some cases, not every case, but I mean to ask for help. So that would be the best I can say to someone I've never met. Find somebody who can help you. There is a lot of information available. The IANS group here in the U.S. It has a website that can be very useful to a lot of people, and they have access to a lot of interviews, which may be useful to those. Those who don't have access to something like that, I think there in most countries there are organizations that they can reach out to. But yeah, reach out. One of the things that I learned was that because we are all containing the DNA of the source of all creation, we are all brothers and sisters, in that we need to look out for each other, because that's what we're here for. That's my hope, is that people can find the help they need, and perhaps something in my story will give them an opening to go look for something they hadn't thought about before. And that when I speak in front of people, I usually ask them to just hold open their hands. Not that I'm going to give them anything other than let them receive a message, whether or not they want to take it home with them or not. But when you close your hands, then you're not open to anything. A closed hand is usually a closed mind.
I love that. That's a beautiful saying. Philip, you mentioned having written a book about your experience and about what you've learned from it, which I absolutely loved. Can you tell us where can we find it for anybody that's interested?
At the moment, it's available on Amazon, and it's called 6 Minutes in Eternity, which is a reference to the 6 minutes when I was lying flat on the floor before they were able to restart my heart. An interesting thing about that time frame is someone asked me, well, how long did you think you were in this other dimension? Okay, if I use a human term, time frame, I said it felt like centuries. It felt that long. And I was really surprised reading my medical reports that it was only a little over 6 minutes, which actually is kind of at the edge of where they can bring a person back. But time and space are much different in that other dimension because all you have to do there is be. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to go out for a day job. I mean, you don't have to get paid. You just be. And so I would ask anyone who listens to this, just sit. Take 5 minutes and just sit and think about what it would be like if you did not have anything going on other than you just sitting there calmly being yourself. That can be a transformative thing in itself, but that's what it was like. I mean, there was no agenda. I mean, it was great. Now we have agendas here because that's how we navigate this plane of experience. But understand that once we're done here, that's not going to be the end of it. We're going to get to go somewhere else, whether we like it or not. In our thinking here, it'll happen, but it'll all be joyous.
Amazing. And that's so beautiful. I hear that a lot, that the fact that there's no time in other dimensions. And it just seems that from knowing what I know now, that every time I think of time or I think of space, it just becomes such a relative notion, because then you know that there's other spaces where that's not even a thing. And you become, I think, more aware of these human constructs, as they say, like, time and agendas. Sure, they're super important here, but then it's not the end all be all.
Exactly. You've hit the point I was going to make, but had missed it along the way. We use time here to navigate this existence, but it hasn't always been that way. 20,000 years ago, I don't think people really considered time other than, the earth turning and the sun coming up and then night. The time aspect for me now is that in this universe that we have become the focal point of, even though we're just a real small dot out in the middle of this energetic universe, is that time, the way we construct it, is only usable in this Earth, and we relate it to other planets, of course. But we only use time here for our own navigation. Our time is subordinate to eternal time because eternal time surrounds us. And within that surrounding eternal time is our little function of clockwork and navigation in that sense. But I'm going to ask everyone to just consider this. We are living in eternity right at this moment. And the reason I say that, if you think back to your grandparents, great-grandparents, and beyond, if they thought about it, that sometime beyond their existence would be eternity for them. Because, again, the physical aspects stop. So everything else then becomes and melds into eternity. So the time we are living in right now is that portion of eternity that they thought was beyond them. So we're already in it. So if that's possible, why can't that border be dissolved and expand beyond to an eternity? And, why can't there be infinite colors that, we can't see with our low wattage eyes? Why can't there be infinite tones that we can't hear with our low wattage ears and hearing? And why can't there be infinite knowledge? Because we can't understand that concept with our low wattage data that we have here. Now, it doesn't mean we can't accomplish things to make lives better here. But again, it comes down to a choice. We can do that, or we can make choices where we want to destroy other people's. And it comes back to a choice. What is it? Why is it that you want something? Is it for your betterment, or is it for your help? Is it for your learning? Is it for humanity's betterment, or humanity's downfall? I mean, the question comes back to is why do you want it? So
that's a question I think we should all ask ourselves, and more often than not, I would say. Philip, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you for sharing your story and your message of hope. It was so beautiful listening to it, and I think we've all gotten so much out of it.
Well, thank you, Sabrina. This has been a real pleasure for me, and I appreciate your interest in my story. And if people are interested, they can find me on Facebook at P. Hossider Books, or even if they have a question, I'm willing to answer it, and they can find me at philiphossiderbooks@gmail.com.